Sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest heart worth fighting for. Sometimes a man's past follows him like a shadow, but his future walks beside him in tiny boots. In Bitter Creek, 8-year-old Joe stands in line with grown men looking for ranch work. Everyone passes her by. She's too small, they say, shaking their heads. Then Buckwild rides into town. This giant cowboy has scars and secrets, but when he sees Joe, he doesn't see her size. He sees her fire. He pays double what she asks without blinking. The townspeople laugh and whisper, "What's this dangerous man doing with a child nobody wants?" What they don't know is that Joe might be more than she appears, and Buck's quiet retirement from violence might be coming to an end. What secret connects them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered chalkboard outside McKinnon's general store had seen better days. Much like everything else in Bitter Creek, each morning, local ranchers and business owners scrawled job offerings across its sun-bleached surface. Day labor, cattle driving, fence mending, anything that required strong backs and willing hands. By noon, most names got crossed off as workers claimed their wages and purpose for another day. Joe had been standing in that line for 3 months now, ever since old Mrs. Patterson, who ran the orphanage, had declared her old enough to earn her keep or find somewhere else to sleep. At 8 years old, Joe understood the harsh arithmetic of frontier survival better than most children twice her age. No work meant no food. No food meant joining the growing number of unmarked graves. On the hill outside town, Buckwild noticed her. Before he noticed anything else about Bitter Creek, she stood ramrod straight, despite barely reaching the belt buckles of the men around her, chin raised with a defiance that reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. Her clothes hung loose, hand-me-downs from the church donation barrel, but she'd taken care to scrub the dirt from her face and hands. Pride, he recognized. The kind that wouldn't bend even when it probably should. "You looking for work, mister?" Samuel Thornton approached Buck with the cautious respect reserved for strangers who wore their guns like they knew how to use them. "I'm Sam Thornton. Got a ranch about 5 miles north of here. Could use a good foreman." Buck's eyes remained fixed on the small figure in line. "That child there. She looking for work too?" Thornton followed his gaze and chuckled, not unkindly. "Joe, hell, she's been trying for months. Good heart, but she's too small for ranch work. Can't lift a proper hay bale or handle the big horses. Most folks just don't have use for—" "I'll take her." Buck's voice carried the kind of finality that ended conversations. "Double her asking wage." The line went quiet. Joe turned, her green eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. Buck saw intelligence there, and calculation. The child was already wondering what the catch might be. "Smart girl. You sure about that?" Thornton scratched his graying beard. "I mean, she's got spirit, but practical work, I'm sure." Buck pulled a silver dollar from his vest pocket, more money than most ranch hands saw in a week. He placed it directly into Joe's small palm, her fingers closing around it instinctively. "You know horses, girl?" "Yes, sir." Her voice carried the careful politeness of someone who'd learned that manners might be the difference between eating and going hungry. "I can ride, and I'm good with the ornery ones. Most animals like me better than people do." Buck almost smiled at that. "Why's that, you think?" Joe considered the question seriously. "Animals don't care how big you are if you're not afraid of them. They smell fear, but they also smell honesty. I reckon I smell more honest than afraid most days." This time Buck did smile, a rare expression that transformed his weathered features. "Good answer. You'll work for me at the Thornton Ranch. Fair wages, fair treatment, and I'll teach you things that'll serve you better than book learning." The murmur of voices around them carried notes of disbelief and concern. Buck caught fragments. "Strange arrangement. What's he want with a child? Man like that's got dark reasons." He'd heard worse whispers in his time. Samuel Thornton cleared his throat. "Well then, I reckon we're all set. Joe, you can ride out with us now if you've got your things." "Everything I own fits in this." Joe held up a small cloth bundle tied with string. Inside, Buck glimpsed a spare dress, a worn book, And something that caught the light, something metal and precious. The ride to the Thornton Ranch took them through country that still held its breath between civilization and wilderness. Rolling grassland stretched toward distant mountains, punctuated by stands of cottonwood that marked seasonal streams. It was good land, the kind men fought and died for, though Buck suspected not many folks in Bitter Creek understood just how valuable their little piece of frontier had become. Joe rode behind him on his horse, a massive bay gelding that stood 17 hands and had carried Buck through more dangerous country than he cared to remember. The child sat the horse like she'd been born to it, adjusting naturally to the animal's gait and never once asking to rest. "That's a fine horse," she said, during a brief stop to water the animals. "What's his name?" "General." Buck loosened the cinch to give the horse a breather. "He's seen a lot of country. Like you." The child's directness caught him off guard. "Like me? You were a soldier?" Buck studied her face, looking for the motivation behind the question. Curiosity mostly, but something sharper underneath. This child had learned to read people for survival. "Something like that." Joe nodded as if that explained everything she needed to know. She had the frontier child's understanding that adults carried histories they didn't discuss, and the wisdom not to push when a door closed. The Thornton Ranch house sat in a natural clearing surrounded by timber that provided windbreak and water access. It was solid construction. Logs chinked tight against winter storms, a stone chimney that spoke of warm fires and hot meals. Martha Thornton emerged from the kitchen as they approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Sam, you brought company." Her voice carried the careful warmth of a woman who'd learned to welcome strangers while keeping her guard up. "This is Buck Wild, our new foreman. And this little one is Joe. She'll be working with us too." Martha's eyes went immediately to Joe, and Buck watched something maternal and protective flicker across her features. "Child, when's the last time you had a proper meal?" Joe's chin lifted with that familiar pride. "I eat regular enough, Mom." "I'm sure you do, but there's eating and then there's eating well. Come inside and we'll see about getting some meat on those bones." The ranch house interior spoke of years spent building a life worth defending. Hand-hewn furniture that would last generations, quilts that told stories in their patterns, the warm smell of bread and coffee that meant home to folks with roots. Joe's eyes took in everything with the careful attention of someone who'd never taken comfort for granted. "How many hands you running?" Buck asked Samuel as Martha bustled Joe toward the kitchen. "Down to 4 regular men since the troubles started. Had 8 last spring, but..." Samuel's expression darkened. "Well, we'll talk about that later. Right now, let's get you both settled." Buck's room was in the bunkhouse with the other hands, but Martha insisted Joe would sleep in the main house. "There's a small room off the kitchen that'll suit her fine. Her child needs proper looking after." Over dinner, Buck learned the rhythm of the Thornton household. Martha ruled the kitchen with gentle efficiency. Samuel talked through the day's work and tomorrow's plans. And the ranch hands, weathered men named Pete, Carlos, Dutch, and a young man called simply Kid, shared the easy camaraderie of people who depended on each other. Joe listened more than she spoke, but Buck noticed she missed nothing. When Pete mentioned a fence section that needed mending, her eyes tracked to the tool shed through the window, calculating what supplies they'd need. When Carlos complained about a horse that wouldn't take the bit properly, she asked quiet questions about the animal's history that showed real understanding. After dinner, Buck found himself on the front porch with Samuel, both men nursing coffee and watching the sun paint the mountains purple and gold. "Mind if I ask what you see in that child?" Samuel's tone carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Most men wouldn't take on the responsibility. Buck was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing the outline of something in his vest pocket. "Had a daughter once. She'd be about Joe's age now if..." He stopped. The words caught somewhere between memory and regret. "I'm sorry. Long time ago." Buck's voice carried the weight of years spent learning to live with loss. "Joe reminds me that some things are worth protecting, even when the world seems determined to break them." Samuel nodded slowly. "This country's hard on children. Hard on everyone, but especially the small ones. Takes a special kind of stubborn to survive out here at her age. She's got that stubborn. Buck smiled slightly. Question is whether I can teach her the skills to back it up. From inside the house came the sound of Joe's laughter at something Martha had said. Bright and genuine in a way that made both men pause to listen. Martha's good with children, Samuel said. Never had any of our own, but she's got the instincts for it. Joe'll be safe here. Buck hoped that was true. Something about this whole situation felt balanced on a knife's edge, though he couldn't yet put his finger on what had him uneasy. Maybe it was the way some of the townspeople had looked at Joe, or the questions about her background that no one seemed eager to answer. Maybe it was just the old lawman's instinct that had kept him alive this long, warning him that peace never lasted as long as folks hoped it would. That night, as Buck settled into his bunk, he pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest and opened it carefully. The photograph inside showed a young girl with dark hair and serious eyes. His daughter Sarah, lost to fever 3 winters past. Below her image, an inscription read, "Time heals all wounds, but love endures forever." He'd carried that watch through a dozen towns and twice as many jobs, always moving, never settling, never letting himself care too much about anyone or anything. But something about Joe's fierce independence and hidden vulnerability had cracked open a door he'd thought permanently sealed. Through the thin bunkhouse walls, he could hear the soft murmur of Martha's voice reading to Joe from what sounded like a book of Bible stories. The child's questions came sharp and thoughtful. She wanted to understand not just what happened in the stories, but why people made the choices they did. Smart girl, maybe too smart for her own good in a place like Bitter Creek. Buck closed the watch and settled back on his narrow bunk, but sleep came slowly. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch created their familiar symphony. Horses shifting in the corral, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through grass. Peaceful sounds that should have been comforting. Instead, Buck found himself listening for sounds that didn't belong, watching shadows that moved wrong, preparing for trouble he couldn't name, but felt coming like a storm on the horizon. Tomorrow he'd start teaching Joe the skills she'd need to survive in this country. Tonight, he'd keep watch over the fragile peace they'd found, knowing from hard experience that such moments were precious exactly because they couldn't last. The railroad survey stakes appeared overnight, like tombstones, marking the death of something precious. Buck spotted them first, riding the north pasture fence line with Joe in the early morning light. Wooden markers driven deep into Thornton soil, each one bearing the crisp lettering of the Continental Western Railroad Company. "What are those?" Joe asked, her young voice cutting through the morning quiet. Buck's jaw tightened as he counted the stakes, 12 of them, forming a line that cut straight through the heart of Samuel's best grazing land. Trouble. They rode closer and Buck dismounted to examine the nearest marker. The wood was fresh pine, the letters burned deep with a professional brand. Someone had come in the night with surveying equipment and a crew large enough to mark off nearly 1,000 acres in a single evening. "Mr. Buck?" Joe's voice carried a note of concern that made him look up. She was pointing toward the eastern ridge, where dust clouds marked the approach of riders. 5 men crested the hill, moving with the purposeful confidence of people who owned whatever ground their horses touched. Buck recognized the type immediately, railroad men, the kind who measured progress in miles of track laid and obstacles removed. The lead rider wore a suit that cost more than most ranch hands made in a year, his horse a fine-blooded animal that had never known hard work. "You there." The man in the suit called out as they approached. "This is private railroad business. You'll need to move along." Buck straightened slowly, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "This is Thornton land. Has been for 15 years. Not anymore." The man produced a rolled document from his saddlebag. "Continental Western Railroad holds surveying rights granted by territorial authority. We're mapping the most efficient route for our new line to California. Surveying rights don't give you ownership." Buck's voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're trespassing." The railroad man's smile held no warmth. "Perhaps you don't understand the situation. Progress waits for no one, especially not dirt farmers clinging to worthless acreage. The railroad offers fair compensation for any land we require, and if folks don't want to sell, then they discover that fighting progress is expensive and usually futile. The man's companions shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons with practiced ease. I'm sure reasonable people can reach reasonable agreements. Joe watched the exchange with the intensity of a child learning hard lessons about how the world worked. Buck could feel her tension, the way she leaned forward in the saddle, ready to run or fight depending on his signal. You boys need to collect your stakes and ride out. Buck's tone remained conversational, but something had changed in his posture. The easygoing ranch foreman disappeared, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. Now, the railroad man laughed. One broken-down cowboy and a child against 5 armed men? I think you're confused about who gives orders here. That was his mistake. Buck moved with fluid precision, his Colt appearing in his hand before any of the railroad men could clear leather. 2 shots fired so close together they sounded like one, sent weapons spinning from the hands of the nearest riders. A 3rd shot creased the suitman's hat brim, the bullet passing close enough to part his hair. Jesus! One of the railroad men clutched his stinging hand. Where the hell did that come from? Practice. Buck's gun never wavered. Now collect your stakes and ride out before I decide you represent a permanent threat to this property. The transformation was remarkable. 5 confident men became 5 nervous riders, suddenly aware they'd misjudged their opposition. The man in the suit tried to maintain his composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This isn't over, he said, attempting to salvage authority from the situation. The railroad doesn't forget interference. Neither do I. Buck's smile was colder than winter wind. Remember that. Joe watched in fascination as the railroad men gathered their stakes with hurried efficiency and rode out, their earlier swagger replaced by the urgent desire to put distance between themselves and Buck's steady aim. How did you do that? She asked once they were alone. Years of practice I hoped never to need again. Buck holstered his weapon and remounted General. We need to get back and tell Samuel what's happening. The ride back to the ranch house felt different now, charged with the electricity of approaching storm. Buck found himself scanning the horizon constantly, noting potential cover, calculating distances and angles with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived too many ambushes to take peace for granted. Samuel's reaction to the news was predictably grim. Railroad survey stakes on my land? They can't do that legally. Legal and what they can get away with are 2 different things. Buck accepted the coffee Martha offered, but remained standing, restless energy keeping him in motion. They'll be back, probably with more men and less polite conversation. What do they want with our land? Martha asked. It's good grazing, but hardly worth the trouble of a railroad war. Buck had been wondering the same thing. The route the stakes marked didn't make sense for efficient railroad construction. Too many natural obstacles, too much expense for minimal gain. Unless they wanted something specific that lay beneath Thornton soil. Maybe it's not about the land, Joe said quietly from her corner where she'd been listening to the adult conversation. Maybe it's about what's under it. 3 pairs of adult eyes turned to her. What do you mean, child? Samuel asked, Joe's face scrunched in concentration. Old Pete was telling stories yesterday about the mine shaft up in the North Hills. Said there used to be gold mining here before the Indians drove the miners out. What if the railroad knows something we don't? Buck felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Gold would explain the railroad's interest, the overnight surveying, the willingness to use intimidation. It would also explain why they seemed so confident about eventually acquiring the land. There's more. Martha's voice was tight with worry. While you were out, a stranger came by asking questions about Joe. Buck's attention snapped to her immediately. What kind of questions? About her family, where she came from, how long she'd been in Bitter Creek, said he was a traveling preacher interested in helping orphans, but Martha shook her head. Something felt wrong about him. The way he looked at her, like he was measuring her for something. What did he look like? Tall, thin, dressed in black, had a scar across his left cheek and eyes, like chips of winter ice. He didn't give a name, just said he'd be around town for a few days. Buck's blood went cold. The description matched Ezra Cole, a bounty hunter he'd tangled with years ago during his martial days. Cole was good at his job and utterly without conscience when it came to collecting his fees. If he was sniffing around Joe, it meant someone had put a price on her head. "Joe," Buck said carefully, "do you know anything about your parents? About where you came from before Bitter Creek?" The child's face went guarded. "Mrs. Patterson said my mama died of fever when I was little. Said I was found wandering alone and the church took me in." "Why?" Buck exchanged glances with Samuel and Martha. "Probably nothing. Just want to make sure you're safe." But it wasn't nothing, and they all knew it. Between the railroad pressure and a bounty hunter asking questions, Joe had somehow become the center of forces she couldn't understand and dangers she couldn't imagine. That evening, Buck found Joe in the barn, brushing down General with careful attention to detail. The child had taken naturally to horse care, showing an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that impressed even the experienced hands. "Joe, I need to ask you something important." Buck settled onto a hay bale where he could watch her face. "Do you have anything that belonged to your mother?" "Anything at all?" Joe's hand stilled on the brush. For a moment, Buck thought she might not answer. Then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished with age and wear. This was hers. "Mrs. Patterson said they found it around my neck when they took me in." Joe's thumb traced the locket's surface. "There's a picture inside, but it's too faded to make out much." Buck examined the locket carefully. The silver was good quality, and the craftsmanship spoke of expensive work. On the back, barely visible, were initials that made his heart skip: E.M. Elizabeth Morrison. Blackjack Morrison's daughter. Suddenly everything made terrible sense. The bounty hunter, the questions about Joe's background, even the railroad's intense interest in this particular piece of land. Blackjack Morrison had been one of the most notorious outlaws in the territory before Buck had put him in the ground 5 years ago. Legend said he'd hidden a fortune in stolen gold somewhere in this area before his final robbery went wrong. If Joe was Blackjack's granddaughter, she might be the key to finding that treasure. And if word had gotten out about her identity, every treasure hunter and bounty seeker west of the Mississippi would be heading for Bitter Creek. Buck closed his fingers around the locket, his mind racing through implications and dangers. He looked at Joe, young, brave, trusting, and realized that keeping her safe was going to require him to become someone he'd hoped never to be again. The retired lawman was gone. Buck Wild, the man who'd brought down Blackjack Morrison and a dozen other killers, was back. And this time, he had something worth fighting for. The morning after the railroad confrontation, Buck began Joe's education in survival. Not the gentle lessons of reading and arithmetic that Martha provided in the evenings, but the hard skills that might keep her alive in a country where being small and defenseless was often a death sentence. "First rule," Buck said, leading Joe to a clearing behind the barn where they wouldn't be observed. "Never draw a weapon unless you're prepared to use it. Second rule, if you draw it, make sure you hit what you're aiming at." Joe nodded solemnly, her small hands wrapped around the scaled-down Colt Buck had modified for her grip. The weapon was still too large, but she could manage the trigger pull, and the weight didn't seem to bother her. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked, as Buck set up tin cans on a fallen log 20 paces away. "Because the world's not always going to be as safe as the Thornton Ranch." Buck checked her stance, adjusting her feet and the angle of her shoulders. "Because sometimes the only thing standing between you and harm is your ability to defend yourself, like when those railroad men came." "Exactly like that." Buck stepped back, watching as Joe lined up her first shot. "Breathe steady, squeeze gentle, don't jerk the trigger." The first shot went wide, but not by much. The second clipped the edge of a can. By the third, Joe was beginning to understand the rhythm of aim and fire, the way the weapon bucked in her hands and how to compensate for it. "You're a natural," Buck observed, and he wasn't just being encouraging. The child had the steady nerves and precise coordination that couldn't be taught, only discovered. As they practiced, Buck found his thoughts drifting to another time, another place where he'd taught someone to shoot. Sarah had been 6 when he'd first put a small rifle in her hands, explaining that frontier children needed frontier skills. She'd been eager to learn, proud of her growing accuracy, delighted when she could finally hit a target 3 times out of 5. The memory brought the familiar ache of loss, but also something new, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Teaching Joe felt like honoring his daughter's memory rather than betraying it. "Tell me about your family," Joe said during a break. Her direct way of asking questions, catching him off guard as usual. Buck was quiet for a long moment, cleaning his Colt with the automatic precision of long habit. Had a wife named Catherine. Beautiful woman, kind heart, probably too good for a man like me. And a daughter, Sarah. She'd be about your age now. What happened to them? The simple question carried the weight of Buck's deepest regret. Fever took them both one winter while I was away chasing outlaws. Came home to find 2 graves and an empty house. His voice roughened. Should have been there. Should have protected them. Joe studied his face with the serious expression of a child trying to understand adult pain. You couldn't know they'd get sick. Maybe not. But I chose the job over the family too many times. Told myself I was keeping the territory safe for people like them, but mostly I just liked the excitement of the hunt. Buck holstered his weapon and met Joe's eyes. "That's a mistake I won't make again." They walked back toward the ranch house in comfortable silence, but Buck's mind was working through problems and possibilities. Joe's connection to Blackjack Morrison created dangers he was only beginning to understand. If Ezra Cole was indeed in Bitter Creek asking questions, others would follow. The bounty on Blackjack's treasure had drawn treasure hunters for 5 years. Now they'd have a living link to the outlaw himself. That evening, Buck found Samuel on the front porch, staring out at the darkness with the troubled expression of a man watching his world change in ways he couldn't control. "Railroad sent a lawyer by today," Samuel said without preamble. "Polite as you please, offering to buy the ranch for fair market value." "How fair?" "About half what the land's worth, assuming I could find another buyer." Samuel's laugh held no humor. "Funny thing is, he already had the papers drawn up. Knew exactly which parcels they wanted, right down to the acre." Buck settled into the chair beside him, his mind working through the implications. "They're moving fast. That usually means they're working against some kind of deadline. That's what I figure. Question is, what's driving the urgency?" Before Buck could answer, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, ranch hands Pete, Carlos, and Dutch, returning from the evening cattle check. But something was wrong with their posture, the way they rode hunched forward in their saddles. "Boss!" Pete called as they approached the house. "We got problems." Buck and Samuel met them at the hitching post, where the lamplight revealed grim faces and dusty clothes that spoke of hard riding. "Found cattle down in the south pasture," Carlos reported, swinging stiffly from his saddle. "Dozen head, maybe more. Poisoned, looks like." Samuel's face went white. "Poisoned? You sure?" "Pretty sure. They were clustered around the waterhole, all dead. No sign of predator attack or disease. Dutch here knows poison symptoms." Dutch nodded grimly. "Seen it before when I worked down in Texas. Somebody dumped something in the water to kill the stock." Buck felt cold anger settling in his chest. Killing livestock was an escalation, a message that the railroad's patience was running thin. It was also a crime that demanded response. In cattle country, you didn't poison another man's herd without expecting retaliation. Any sign of who might have done it? Buck asked. "Tracks around the waterhole were pretty churned up, but we found boot prints that don't match any of our boys." Pete pulled off his hat and ran fingers through thinning hair. Looked like maybe 3-4 men working quiet like in the dark. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. 15 years I've been building this herd. Those cattle represented months of work, thousands of dollars in lost income. It's not about the money, Buck said quietly. It's about pressure. They want you scared, desperate, ready to sell for whatever they offer. Well, they succeeded in making me mad. Samuel's voice carried the edge of a man pushed past his breaking point. "What do we do about it?" Buck was quiet for a moment, thinking through options and consequences. The old Buck Wild would have ridden out immediately, tracked the poisoners to their source, and settled the matter with gunfire. But he had Joe to think about now, and the Thorntons who'd become family. Starting a shooting war might protect their pride, but it could get everyone killed. "We document everything," he said finally. "Take photographs if we can, preserve evidence. Then we make it clear that further attacks will be met with force." "That's it?" Samuel's voice carried disappointment. "They kill my cattle and we take pictures." "They made the first move," Buck replied. "Now they know we're paying attention. Next time they try something, we'll be ready." But even as he spoke the words, Buck knew the situation was escalating beyond simple intimidation tactics. The railroad had resources and legal backing. Ezra Cole represented a different kind of threat entirely. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Joe, an 8-year-old girl whose bloodline might hold the key to a fortune in stolen gold. As the men talked through security measures and defensive preparations, Buck found himself reaching unconsciously for the pocket watch that held Sarah's photograph. He'd failed to protect his first family. This time would be different. This time, he'd be ready for whatever came out of the darkness. 3 days after the cattle poisoning, Buck made a discovery that changed everything he thought he knew about his past and Joe's future. He was cleaning out his saddlebags when a folded paper fell from a side pocket, a paper he hadn't seen in 5 years but recognized immediately. The wanted poster was yellowed with age and worn from handling, but the face staring back at him was unmistakable. Black Jack Morrison, wanted dead or alive, $5,000 reward. Below the sketch were details of the outlaw's crimes: bank robbery, cattle rustling, murder, and a dozen other charges that had made him one of the most hunted men in the territory. Buck's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper completely. At the bottom, in his own neat handwriting, were the words, "Captured and killed by U.S. Marshal Buck Wild, September 15th, 1870, case closed." The irony struck him like a physical blow. For 5 years, he'd carried the proof of the deed that haunted his conscience, the killing of Black Jack Morrison in a shootout outside Silver City. Now he was protecting and training Morrison's granddaughter, the child of the daughter Buck never knew the outlaw had. The sound of approaching footsteps made him fold the poster quickly and stuff it back into his saddlebag. Jo appeared in the barn doorway, her arms full of the grooming supplies she'd been organizing with typical efficiency. "Mr. Buck, you look like you've seen a ghost." The child's observation was uncomfortably accurate. "Just thinking about old times," Buck replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. Jo set down the grooming supplies and studied his face with the unsettling directness that seemed to see too much. "Bad old times. Some good, some bad. That's how life works. You take what comes and try to learn from it." But even as he spoke, Buck was wrestling with a moral dilemma that cut to the heart of who he thought himself to be. He'd spent years as a lawman, bringing justice to those who broke it. Black Jack Morrison had been a killer and a thief, responsible for the deaths of innocent people, including women and children. Buck had felt no regret when Morrison died in that dusty street, had even felt a sense of satisfaction that another dangerous criminal would never hurt anyone again. Now he was looking at Morrison's granddaughter, an 8-year-old girl who'd never harmed anyone, who worked hard and asked for nothing more than a chance to prove herself. The sins of the grandfather couldn't possibly be visited on the grandchild. Yet Buck knew there were people who would see Joe's bloodline as justification for any action they chose to take. "Joe," Buck said carefully, "what do you remember about your mother?" "Anything at all?" Joe's face scrunched in concentration. "Sometimes I have dreams. A woman with dark hair singing to me, gentle hands, and a voice that made me feel safe." She touched the locket at her throat. "And sometimes I remember running, being scared and running through trees in the dark." "Running from what?" "I don't know. Just danger. The feeling that something bad was coming and we had to get away." Joe's eyes met his. "Why are you asking about this?" Buck studied the child's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden knowledge. But Joe's confusion seemed genuine. Whatever memories she retained from her early childhood were fragmentary and unclear. She didn't know who her grandfather had been or what legacy his name carried. No particular reason, Buck lied. Just curious about your family history. But that night, lying on his narrow bunk and listening to the night sounds of the ranch, Buck found himself unable to sleep. The moral weight of his situation pressed down on him like a physical burden. He'd killed Joe's grandfather in the line of duty, orphaning her mother and setting in motion the chain of events that had eventually left Joe alone in the world. Did that make him responsible for her circumstances? Did his past actions create an obligation to protect her now? Or was he simply trying to assuage his own guilt by playing the role of guardian to the child whose family he'd destroyed? The next morning brought news that pushed such philosophical questions into the background. Martha met Buck at the kitchen door with worry lines creasing her forehead. "That man came back," she said without preamble. "The one asking questions about Joe. He's been talking to people in town, offering money for information about her background." Buck's blood went cold. "What kind of money?" "Enough to get people talking. Mrs. McKinnon at the general store said he seemed particularly interested in any old records about children brought to the orphanage 5 years ago." Buck cursed under his breath. Ezra Cole was closing in, using the systematic approach that made him so effective as a bounty hunter. It would only be a matter of time before he connected Joe to the Morrison name. And once that happened, every treasure hunter and criminal west of the Mississippi would descend on Bitter Creek. "Where's Joe now?" "Out with Samuel, checking the eastern fence line." "But Buck, there's more." The man wasn't alone this time. He had 2 others with him, rough-looking types who stayed mounted while he did his talking. Buck's tactical mind immediately began calculating threats and responses. 3 men suggested serious intent rather than casual inquiry. If Cole had brought backup, it meant he was preparing for resistance and possibly violence. "Martha, I need you to do something for me. If anything happens, anything at all that seems dangerous, you take Joe and ride to the church in town. Tell Pastor Williams that Buck Wild sent you and you need sanctuary. He'll understand." Martha's eyes widened. "Buck, what's going on? Who is that man and why is he so interested in Joe?" Buck wrestled with how much to tell her. The truth would only create more fear and worry, but she deserved enough information to protect herself and Joe, if necessary. "Joe's family history is more complicated than she knows," he said finally. "There are people who might want to use her to settle old scores or find things that were lost a long time ago. I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen." "What kind of things?" "The kind that get people killed over." Buck's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made his decision. "I need to know you'll keep her safe if I'm not here to do it." Martha studied his face, reading the resolution there. "You're planning something dangerous. I'm planning to end this before it gets worse." Buck checked his guns out of long habit, ensuring they were clean and loaded. "Joe doesn't know what's coming, and I want to keep it that way as long as possible. She's just a child. She deserves to feel safe and protected." But even as he spoke the words, Buck knew that Joe's childhood innocence was living on borrowed time. The forces gathering around them wouldn't be satisfied with half measures or negotiations. Soon, very soon, the past would collide with the present in ways that would test everything Buck believed about justice, redemption, and the price of protecting those we love. The wanted poster in his saddlebag seemed to burn like a brand, a reminder that some debts could never be fully paid, and some sins echoed across generations in ways no one could predict or control. The weight of his marshal's badge had never felt heavier than it did now, hidden in the bottom of Buck's saddlebag like a guilty secret. 20 years he'd worn that star with pride, believing in the clear lines between right and wrong, law and lawlessness. Now those lines blurred like ink in water every time he looked at Joe. She was in the barn, teaching Kid how to properly braid a horse's mane, her small fingers working with the patient precision of someone who understood that animals responded to gentle consistency. Watching her, Buck struggled to reconcile the child's innocence with the blood that ran in her veins. "She's got away with horses," Samuel observed, joining Buck at the corral fence. "Kid's been trying to get that mare to stand still for grooming for weeks. Joe had her calm in 5 minutes. She understands them," Buck replied. "Animals know when someone's not trying to hurt them, like people, you think." Buck shot him a sharp look, but Samuel's expression remained innocent. Still, there was something in the rancher's tone that suggested deeper knowledge than he'd admitted. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Coleman from town. His horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Coleman was a good man, but weak, the kind of lawman who kept the peace through compromise rather than confrontation. Seeing him arrive at full gallop suggested trouble beyond his usual capacity to handle. "Buck, Samuel, we need to talk." Coleman's face was pale beneath his weathered hat. "Had a killing in town last night." Buck's blood chilled. "Who?" "Tom Brennan, the old-timer who sometimes worked odd jobs around the church. Found him behind McKinnon's store with his throat cut." Coleman's voice shook slightly. "But that's not the worst of it. Before he died, he talked to that stranger who's been asking questions about the orphan girl. Brennan was drunk, needed money, probably told him more than he should have." "What kind of more?" Samuel asked, though Buck suspected they all knew the answer. "Brennan was working at the church 5 years ago when they brought Joe in. He remembered details, where she was found, what she was wearing, who brought her." Coleman wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Word is, the stranger paid him $50 for information, then killed him to keep him quiet." Buck felt the familiar cold settle in his chest. The emotional shutdown that had kept him alive through too many dangerous situations. Ezra Cole was escalating, which meant he'd learned something significant about Joe's identity. A man didn't commit murder over casual curiosity. "There's more," Coleman continued. "Railroad brought in a private security force yesterday. 20 men, all armed, supposedly to protect their surveying operations. But they're not staying in the railroad camp. They're spread out around town, asking questions, watching people." "Watching who?" Buck asked, though he already knew. Anyone connected to the Thornton Ranch. "Anyone who spent time with the girl." Coleman's eyes met Buck's. "They're building up to something, and I don't have the manpower to stop them." Samuel's jaw tightened. "This is still America, last I checked. They can't just occupy a town with private soldiers." "They can if nobody stops them," Buck said quietly. "And they will if it serves their purpose." That afternoon, Buck found Joe sitting by the creek that ran through the ranch's eastern pasture, her bare feet dangling in the water while she worked on a piece of leather crafting Martha had taught her. The scene was peaceful, domestic, everything Buck had hoped to preserve for her. "Joe, we need to talk about some things that might be hard to understand." She looked up from her work, green eyes serious. "About my family?" Buck settled beside her on the creek bank, close enough to offer protection, but not so close as to seem threatening. "What do you know about your grandfather?" "Nothing, really. Mrs. Patterson said my mama never talked about her family, that some things were too painful to remember." Joe's fingers stilled on the leather. "Why, did you know him?" The moment of truth arrived like a judgment, and Buck found himself facing the hardest conversation of his life. How do you tell a child that you killed her grandfather? How do you explain that the man who'd become her protector was also the one who'd destroyed her family? "I knew of him," Buck said carefully. "He was an outlaw named Blackjack Morrison, a dangerous man who hurt a lot of people." Joe absorbed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd already learned that the world contained more darkness than adults like to admit. "Was he really bad?" "He was. He stole and killed and caused a lot of pain. But," Buck struggled with the words, "that doesn't mean his family was bad. Sometimes good people come from bad families, and bad people come from good ones. What matters is the choices you make, not the blood you carry. Is that why people are asking questions about me?" "Because of him?" Buck nodded. "There are people who think you might know something about money he stole, or where he hid things. They don't care that you're just a child. They only see you as a way to get what they want." Joe was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. When she spoke, her voice carried a maturity that broke Buck's heart. "Are you going to send me away?" Never. The word came out with such force that it surprised them both. Joe, I want you to understand something. I've made mistakes in my life, done things I'm not proud of. But protecting you isn't one of them. Whatever comes, we face it together. Even if people try to hurt us, especially then. That evening, Buck made his preparations with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on details others overlooked. He cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, checked ammunition supplies, and identified defensive positions that could protect the main house and barn. Samuel found him in the tack room, assembling a collection of rifles that spoke of serious intent, planning for war, planning for whatever comes next. Buck held up a lever-action Winchester, checking the action. Those railroad men aren't here for surveying, and Cole isn't just after bounty money. There's something bigger driving this, something worth killing for. The treasure. Buck nodded. Has to be. Blackjack Morrison was rumored to have hidden a fortune somewhere in this area before his last job went bad. If Joe really is his granddaughter, and if there's any truth to the stories about her knowing something about that treasure, then every criminal and treasure hunter in the territory will be coming for her. Already are. From the look of things, Buck set the rifle aside and faced Samuel directly. This is going to get ugly. If you want to take Martha and leave, I'll understand. This isn't your fight. Samuel's laugh held no humor. Boy, this became my fight the minute they started poisoning my cattle and threatening my family. And like it or not, that girl's become family. Buck felt something ease in his chest. Whatever came next, at least he wouldn't be facing it alone. But as he looked out at the peaceful ranch bathed in evening light, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in the calm before a storm that would test everything they believed about justice, loyalty, and the price of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The badge in his saddlebag seemed to whisper accusations in the darkness, reminding him that the law he'd once served might now demand he surrender the child he'd come to love as his own daughter. The legal papers arrived at dawn, delivered by a nervous clerk who couldn't meet Samuel's eyes as he handed over the official documents. Buck read through them with the careful attention of someone who'd seen enough legal maneuvering to recognize a sophisticated trap. "Eminent domain," he said, setting the papers on the kitchen table where Martha and Joe could see them. "The territorial government has granted the Continental Western Railroad the right to claim any land necessary for their route to California." Samuel's face darkened as he studied the documents. "This is my land. My grandfather's land before that. They can't just take it with papers. They can, and they are," Buck replied grimly. "According to this, you have 30 days to accept their compensation offer or face forced seizure. How much are they offering?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be fair. "Half of what the land's worth, and that's if you don't factor in whatever they think is buried under it." Buck folded the papers and set them aside. "This isn't really about railroad construction. It's about clearing legal obstacles before they start treasure hunting in earnest." Joe had been listening to the conversation with the focused attention of someone learning hard lessons about how power worked in the adult world. "Can't we fight it? In court, I mean. Courts cost money we don't have, and they're probably owned by the same people backing the railroad." Buck's voice carried the bitter knowledge of someone who'd seen justice fail too many times. "Besides, legal battles take time, and I don't think they're planning to wait for judges to settle this." His prediction proved accurate within hours. By midday, the railroad's private security force had established checkpoints on the roads leading to the Thornton Ranch, stopping and questioning anyone trying to enter or leave the property. The message was clear. They were under siege. Cut off from outside help or support, Buck rode out to test their resolve, and found himself facing a hard-eyed man in a duster who carried his authority like a weapon. "Roads closed for railroad business," the man announced. "You'll need to turn around. This is a public road," Buck replied calmly. "Has been for 15 years. Not anymore. Orders from Mr. Morse himself." No unauthorized access to areas under railroad development. Buck studied the checkpoint. 4 men with rifles, positioned to control the high ground, professional in their deployment. These weren't hired thugs, but experienced soldiers, probably veterans of the war who'd found employment in corporate conflicts. And if I choose to ride through anyway? The man's smile held no warmth. Then you'd be trespassing on railroad property and interfering with legitimate business operations. We're authorized to respond accordingly. Buck nodded and turned his horse around, but his mind was cataloging details. Weapons, positions, sightlines, weaknesses. The checkpoint could be taken, but it would cost lives and escalate the conflict beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. Riding back to the ranch, Buck found Jo waiting for him at the corral, her face tight with worry. They won't let us leave, will they? Not easily. Buck dismounted and began unsaddling General, his movements automatic while his mind worked through tactical problems. Jo, I need to ask you something important. In your dreams about your mother, did she ever talk about hiding things? About places that were special or secret? Jo's brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes I dream about a cave, dark and cool, with water dripping somewhere in the back. Mama would take me there when... She stopped, her face going pale. When the bad men were coming. Buck's pulse quickened. What bad men? I don't know. In the dreams, they're just shapes and loud voices. But Mama was scared of them, really scared. She'd take me to the cave and tell me to be quiet no matter what I heard. Jo's voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes I'd hear gunshots. Buck knelt beside her, bringing himself to her eye level. Jo, this cave, do you think you could find it? If you had to? Maybe. In the dreams, it's up in the hills somewhere, near water but hidden behind rocks. She studied his face. Why? What's in the cave? Before Buck could answer, the sound of approaching riders caught their attention. Samuel and the ranch hands were returning from the north pasture, but their posture spoke of trouble. We've got problems, Pete announced as they dismounted. Found more dead cattle this morning, but this time they left a message. He handed Buck a piece of paper that had been nailed to a fence post. The writing was crude, but the meaning was clear. Give us the girl, or lose everything. Martha appeared in the doorway, took one look at the faces around her, and immediately began gathering supplies. How long do we have? Not long, Buck replied. They're moving fast now, probably because they're afraid word will get out and bring federal marshals or territorial authorities. What about the sheriff? Jo asked. Samuel's laugh was bitter. Coleman rode out of town this morning. Said he had urgent business in the territorial capital that might take several weeks. Buck wasn't surprised. Coleman was smart enough to recognize a situation beyond his capabilities, and honest enough not to pretend he could handle it. But his departure left Bitter Creek without even the pretense of law enforcement. That afternoon, a lone rider approached under a white flag. Buck met him at the ranch gate, recognizing the tall, scarred figure of Ezra Cole, even at a distance. Wild, Cole called as he drew near. Been a long time. Not long enough. Buck's hand rested casually near his gun.
What do you want, Ezra?
To offer you a deal. Hand over the Morrison girl, and everyone else walks away unharmed. Simple business transaction. She's 8 years old. She's the key to a fortune in stolen gold, and you know it. Cole's smile was cold as winter wind. Blackjack Morrison hid that treasure somewhere in these hills before you killed him. His granddaughter is the only living person who might know where. She doesn't know anything about any treasure. Maybe not consciously, but blood remembers, Wild. Instincts, inherited memories, the way people are drawn to certain places. It's all connected. Cole leaned forward in his saddle. We've been watching her for months, following her movements, noting where she likes to explore. She's been heading toward the same area repeatedly, like something's calling her home. Buck felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Jo's dreams about the cave, her natural navigation skills, the way she seemed drawn to certain parts of the ranch property. It all pointed toward inherited knowledge she didn't consciously understand. The answer's no, Buck said firmly. I figured you'd say that. Professional pride and all. Cole straightened in his saddle. So here's what's going to happen. Tonight, we're coming for her. You can hand her over peaceful-like, or we can take her over your bodies. Either way, she's leaving with us. And after you get what you want from her? Cole's shrug was eloquent. Child that young, living rough in the wilderness, accidents happen. Tragic, really, but these things can't be helped. Buck's control snapped. His Colt appeared in his hand with lethal speed, the barrel centering on Cole's chest before the bounty hunter could react. Ride out, Buck said quietly. Ride out now, or I'll finish what should have been done years ago. Cole raised his hands, but his smile never wavered. Easy, Wild. No need for unpleasantness. We'll be back tonight with enough men to settle this properly. As Cole rode away, Buck felt the weight of inevitability settling around him like a shroud. The battle lines were drawn, the stakes established. Tonight would bring violence and bloodshed, and when morning came, nothing would ever be the same. Walking back to the house, Buck found Joe waiting for him. Her green eyes full of questions she was afraid to ask. How bad is it? She said simply. Buck looked at this brave, intelligent child who'd somehow become the center of his world and made the hardest decision of his life. Bad enough that we need to consider all our options, he said, including the one where you and I disappear into those hills tonight and let them think we've run away. What about Samuel and Martha? They'll be safer without us here. Buck's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. This fight is about you, Joe. Remove you from the equation, and they'll have no reason to hurt anyone else. But even as he spoke the words, Buck knew it was a lie. The railroad wanted the land, and they'd use any excuse to take it. Joe's presence just gave them a convenient justification for violence. The discovery that changed everything came by accident, as the most important revelations often do. Joe was in her small room off the kitchen, gathering her few possessions for what might be their final night at the ranch. When the clasp on her mother's locket broke, the silver piece fell to the floor, and as Joe knelt to retrieve it, she noticed something impossible. The locket had split open along a seam she'd never seen before, revealing a hidden compartment behind the photograph. Inside, folded to a size no larger than a postage stamp, was a piece of paper covered with tiny, precise markings. Mr. Buck, Joe called, her voice tight with excitement and fear. You need to see this. Buck appeared in the doorway within seconds, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he registered that Joe's call came from discovery rather than danger. What is it? Joe held out the paper with trembling fingers. It was hidden in Mama's locket. I think it might be a map. Buck took the paper carefully, unfolding it with the reverence of someone handling a holy relic. The markings were indeed a map, drawn with the precision of someone who understood that lives might depend on its accuracy. Landmarks he recognized: the creek, the old mine shaft, the distinctive rock formations of the northern hills were all carefully marked in relation to a small X that seemed to indicate a location about 2 miles into the wilderness. But it was the notation at the bottom of the map that made Buck's blood run cold. EM, for Joe, when she's old enough to understand the price of our choices. Love, Mama. Joe, Buck said carefully. How long have you had this locket? Since always. Mrs. Patterson said it was around my neck when they found me. Joe studied Buck's face. What does it mean? Buck stared at the map. Pieces of a much larger puzzle suddenly clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Elizabeth Morrison hadn't just hidden her daughter and died of fever. She'd prepared for the possibility that Joe might someday need to find her grandfather's treasure. The locket hadn't been a simple keepsake, but a carefully constructed inheritance, waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. It means your mother was a lot smarter than anyone gave her credit for, Buck said. And it means we're all in more danger than I thought. Before he could explain further, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ranch yard. But these weren't the railroad security forces or Ezra Cole's hired guns. The riders wore badges and carried themselves with the authority of federal law enforcement. Buck stepped onto the front porch to find himself facing Deputy U.S. Marshal William Hayes, a man he'd worked with during his own law enforcement days. Hayes was honest, competent, and absolutely incorruptible, exactly the kind of lawman the railroad wouldn't want investigating their activities. Buck Wild, Hayes said. dismounting with the careful movements of someone who'd been riding hard for days. "Heard you might be having some trouble out here. Nothing I can't handle," Buck replied, though his eyes were already cataloguing the 5 deputies who'd accompanied Hayes. Good men, all of them, but probably not enough to face the army the railroad had assembled. Maybe, but territorial governor sent us to investigate reports of illegal land seizure and private military forces operating without authority. Hayes tied his horse to the hitching post. "Funny thing is, when we tried to enter Bitter Creek this morning, we found the roads blocked by armed men who claimed to represent railroad interests." Buck felt a surge of hope. If the federal government was finally taking notice of the railroad's activities, it might provide the legal cover necessary to end this conflict without bloodshed. "There's more you need to know," Buck said. "Come inside and I'll explain." But as they gathered around the kitchen table, Buck realized he faced an impossible choice. Revealing the map would prove Joe's connection to Blackjack Morrison's treasure, potentially making her a federal witness in a criminal investigation. But it would also confirm her value to every criminal and treasure hunter in the territory. Hayes listened to Buck's carefully edited account of recent events with the professional attention of someone accustomed to sorting truth from fiction. When Buck finished, the marshal leaned back in his chair and studied Joe with thoughtful eyes. "Miss Joe, do you understand why these people are so interested in you?" Joe nodded solemnly. "They think I know something about my grandfather's stolen money. And do you?" Joe glanced at Buck, seeking guidance. He nodded slightly, and she pulled the map from her pocket. "I do now." Hayes examined the map with the careful attention of someone who understood its significance. "This appears to show the location of Morrison's treasure cache. If authentic, it would be evidence in multiple federal cases involving bank robbery and murder." "It's authentic," Buck said quietly. "The question is what we do about it." Before Hayes could respond, one of his deputies appeared in the doorway with urgent news. "Marshal, we've got problems. Large group of armed riders approaching from the east. Looks like they're planning to surround the ranch." Buck moved to the window and cursed under his breath. At least 30 men were spreading out in a wide circle around the ranch buildings, moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. These weren't the railroad's hired security guards, but professional soldiers, possibly mercenaries, hired specifically for this confrontation. "How many men do you have?" Buck asked Hayes. "6, counting myself." "You, 4 ranch hands and me. Samuel's handy with a rifle, but Martha and Joe need protection." Hayes did the mathematics quickly. "We're outnumbered 5-1, assuming they don't have more men in reserve." "They probably do." Buck checked his weapons out of habit. "This isn't just about the treasure anymore. They're committed to a course of action that requires eliminating witnesses. Then we dig in and wait for reinforcements." "Marshal," Samuel said from his position by the front window, "I don't think they're planning to give us time for reinforcements." A lone rider was approaching under a white flag, but Buck recognized the elegant posture and expensive clothes of someone he'd never met, but had heard described in detail. "Clayton Morse," he said grimly. "The railroad baron himself." Morse was a man in his 50s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, despite the frontier setting. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to buying whatever he wanted and crushing whatever he couldn't buy. "Gentlemen," Morse called as he approached the porch, "I believe we have much to discuss." Buck and Hayes stepped outside to meet him, both men keeping their hands near their weapons. "Mr. Morse," Hayes said formally, "I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Hayes. I have reports of illegal activities involving your railroad operations." Morse's smile was polite and utterly without warmth. "I'm sure any misunderstandings can be cleared up through proper channels. However, I'm here on a more pressing matter. I believe you're harboring a young woman who possesses information vital to recovering stolen federal property. The child is under federal protection." Hayes replied, "The child is the granddaughter of the most notorious outlaw in territorial history, and she holds the key to recovering over $100,000 in stolen gold." Morse's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. "Gold that was taken from my bank in Denver 5 years ago." Buck felt the ground shift beneath him as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Your bank? Clayton Morse owns controlling interest in Denver Merchants and Farmers Bank, Morse explained. The same bank Blackjack Morrison robbed in his final crime spree. The same robbery that led to his death and the disappearance of my gold. So this whole thing, the railroad expansion, the land grab, the private army, it's all been about recovering your stolen money? Morse's smile widened. The railroad expansion is legitimate business, though I'll admit the route was chosen with certain secondary considerations in mind. When my investigators discovered that Morrison's granddaughter was living in this area, it seemed prudent to position my resources accordingly. Hayes stepped forward. Mr. Morse, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy, illegal armed occupation, and about a dozen other federal charges. I think not. Morse raised his hand, and suddenly the ranch was surrounded by armed men, taking cover behind outbuildings, fences, and anything else that would stop a bullet. You see, gentlemen, I've invested far too much time and money in this enterprise to be deterred by legal technicalities. Buck realized with crystal clarity that they'd all been dancing to Morse's tune from the beginning. The man hadn't just stumbled upon Joe's location. He'd orchestrated everything, from the railroad surveys to Ezra Cole's investigation to the legal pressure on the Thorntons. Joe hadn't been hidden away in Bitter Creek for safety. She'd been placed there like bait in a trap that had taken 5 years to spring. The child comes with me, Morse continued, and everyone else lives to see another sunrise. Refuse, and I'm afraid this situation will end tragically for everyone involved. Buck looked at Joe through the kitchen window, seeing her small face pressed against the glass as she watched the confrontation unfold. In that moment, he understood that everything he'd believed about protecting her had been an illusion. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. The past had finally caught up with them all, and there would be no running from it this time. The standoff stretched into evening like a taut wire ready to snap. Buck found himself moving through the ranch house with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on preparation others overlooked. He gathered ammunition, checked sightlines from windows, and mentally catalogued every potential advantage their position offered. It wasn't much. The ranch house was solid construction, but it hadn't been built as a fortress. Too many windows, too many angles of approach. Too little cover between the buildings and the surrounding hills where Morse's men had positioned themselves. Marshal Hayes worked beside him, sharing the grim camaraderie of lawmen who'd found themselves in impossible situations before. How well do you know this country? Hayes asked, studying the map Joe had discovered. Well enough. Buck pointed to the northern hills visible through the kitchen window. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles up that ridge, and a dozen ways to reach it if you know the terrain. Problem is, Morse's men probably know it too. You think that's where Morrison hid the gold? Buck studied the map again, noting details he'd missed in his first examination. The scale looks right and the landmarks match. If Elizabeth Morrison drew this before she died, she knew exactly where her father's treasure was hidden. Joe sat at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap as she listened to the adults' plan for what might be their final battle. The child's composure was remarkable. No tears, no complaints, just the steady attention of someone who understood that her survival might depend on understanding what came next. Joe, Buck said gently, I need you to think carefully about your dreams. The cave where your mother used to take you, can you remember anything else about it? Anything that might help us find it? Jo closed her eyes, her face scrunching with concentration. There was a sound, like metal hitting rock far away, and it smelled like, she paused, searching for words, like old water and something else. Something that made Mama nervous. What kind of something? Sweet but wrong, like flowers that had been dead too long. Buck and Hayes exchanged glances. The smell of decomposition would explain why Morrison had chosen the cave as a hiding place. Few people would investigate a location that reeked of death. There's something else, Joe continued. In the dreams, Mama always counted steps from a big rock that looked like a sleeping bear. 57 steps to a crack in the wall that was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Buck felt excitement building despite their desperate circumstances. With those details, finding Morrison's cache would be possible even in the dark. The question was whether they could reach it before Morse's superior numbers overwhelmed their defenses. Martha appeared from the back bedroom where she'd been gathering supplies, her arms full of ammunition and provisions. "I've packed enough food and water for 3 days," she announced. "Samuel's securing the horses in the barn, and the boys are checking the perimeter." "Mrs. Thornton," Hayes said carefully, "I need you to understand that if shooting starts, this house won't provide adequate protection. You and Joe should consider what?" Martha's voice carried steel. "Running away while our men fight alone? Leaving our home to be burned by greedy men who think violence solves everything?" She set down her supplies and fixed Hayes with a look that would have stopped a charging bull. "Marshal, I've been married to Samuel for 23 years. I've seen drought, flood, Indian raids, and more winters than I care to count. I'm not running from a bunch of dressed-up thieves, no matter how many guns they carry." Buck smiled despite their circumstances. Martha Thornton represented everything good about frontier strength: the refusal to be intimidated, the determination to protect what mattered, the quiet courage that kept civilization alive in wild places. "Then we make our stand here," he said. "But we need a backup plan in case things go wrong." He gathered everyone around the kitchen table, spreading out a hand-drawn map of the ranch and surrounding area. "If they overrun the house, we fall back to the barn. From there, we have 2 options. Try to break through their lines and reach the hills, or make them pay so dearly for every inch that they decide the cost isn't worth it." "What about the treasure?" Samuel asked. "If Joe's right about the location, shouldn't we try to reach it first?" Buck had been wrestling with the same question. The gold represented both an opportunity and a trap. If they could recover it, they'd have something to bargain with. But the journey to the cave would be dangerous, and success would require dividing their already limited forces. "I'll take Joe and try to reach the cache," Buck decided. "The rest of you hold the ranch and keep Morse's attention focused here. If we can recover the gold and get back before—" "No!" Joe's voice cut through the discussion with surprising firmness. "You're not leaving them to fight alone because of me." Buck turned to study the child's face, seeing determination that reminded him painfully of his own daughter's stubborn streak. "Joe, this isn't your decision to make." "Yes, it is." Joe stood up, her small frame radiating the kind of resolve that couldn't be argued with. "This whole thing started because people want to use me to find my grandfather's money. Well, maybe it's time I decided what happens to that money myself." "What do you mean?" Joe's green eyes held a maturity far beyond her years. "We go get the treasure together, all of us. We find it, we take it, and then we give it back to Mr. Morse in exchange for everyone's safety." "That's a lot of gold to give up," Samuel observed. "It's stolen money that's caused nothing but pain and death," Joe replied. "My grandfather killed people for it. My mother died because of it, and now more good people are going to die unless we end this." She looked around the table, meeting each adult's eyes in turn. "I don't want treasure that's covered in blood. I want my family to be safe." Buck felt his heart break and swell simultaneously. This brave child was willing to sacrifice a fortune to protect people who'd shown her kindness. It was exactly the kind of moral courage he'd hoped to teach her, and exactly the kind of decision that could get them all killed. "It might not be that simple," Hayes warned. "Men like Morse don't make deals with children. He wants the gold, but he also wants to eliminate witnesses who can testify about his methods." "Then we don't give him a choice," Buck said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "We take the gold, but we also make sure the whole territory knows what he's done to get it." The plan that emerged was desperate and dangerous, requiring precise timing and more than a little luck. Buck and Joe would slip out during the night and locate Morrison's cache. Meanwhile, Hayes would send one of his deputies on a fast horse to the territorial capital, with a full report of Morse's activities and evidence of federal crimes. The remaining defenders would hold the ranch until reinforcements arrived, or until Buck returned with something to bargain with. As night fell over the ranch, Buck made his final preparations. He'd traded his heavy rifle for a lighter carbine that would be easier to carry through rough terrain. His saddlebags contained ammunition, water, and basic medical supplies. Most importantly, he carried Sarah's photograph in his vest pocket, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd found again in Joe. "You sure about this?" Samuel asked as Buck checked his weapons one final time. "No," Buck admitted. "But it's the best plan we've got, and waiting here just gives Morse more time to bring in reinforcements." He found Joe in the barn, saying goodbye to General with the solemn attention of someone who understood she might not see the horse again. The sight of her small hands stroking the great horse's neck brought back memories of Sarah doing the same thing with her pony, and Buck had to force himself to focus on the present rather than lose himself in grief. "Ready?" he asked softly. Joe nodded, shouldering a pack Martha had prepared for her. Despite the danger they faced, the child looked determined rather than frightened. "Mr. Buck, what if we can't find the cave? What if the map is wrong or I can't remember the details?" "Then we come back and try something else," Buck replied. "But I have a feeling your mother wouldn't have hidden that map unless she was certain you could use it when the time came." They slipped out through the back of the barn, using a route Buck had scouted earlier that would keep them hidden from the watchers on the surrounding hills. The night was moonless but clear, providing enough starlight to navigate by while offering concealment from distant observers. The first mile passed without incident, but Buck remained alert for signs of pursuit or ambush. Morse was too experienced to leave obvious escape routes unguarded, and the absence of immediate opposition made Buck more nervous rather than relieved. "There," Joe whispered, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation silhouetted against the stars. "That's the sleeping bear from my dreams." Buck studied the formation and had to admit the resemblance was unmistakable. 57 steps from that landmark should lead them to the entrance of Morrison's cache. Assuming Joe's inherited memories were accurate, as they approached the rock formation, Buck became aware of other sounds in the darkness: the distant murmur of voices, the soft nickering of horses, the metallic click of weapons being checked. Morse hadn't just surrounded the ranch. He'd positioned men throughout the hills, probably hoping to catch anyone trying to reach the treasure site. "We're not alone out here," Buck warned Joe in a whisper. "I know, but we're closer than they are, and I can feel the cave now. It's like something calling me home." Buck hoped Joe's instincts were correct, because their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Behind them, lights flickered around the ranch buildings as both sides prepared for what might be the final confrontation. Ahead lay unknown dangers and the promise of treasure that had already cost too many lives. They found the crack in the cliff face exactly where Joe's dreams had predicted, a narrow opening that would be invisible to casual observation. Buck lit a small lantern and squeezed through first, emerging into a natural cavern that stretched back into darkness. The smell hit him immediately, the sweet, sick odor of decomposition that Joe had remembered from her childhood dreams. But underlying that was another scent, the metallic tang of gold and silver that every prospector learned to recognize. "It's here," Joe breathed, her voice echoing in the confined space. "I can feel it." Buck raised the lantern and felt his breath catch. The cavern stretched back farther than the light could penetrate, but the floor was littered with evidence of Morrison's final crime spree. Strongboxes, canvas bags, and loose coins created a glittering carpet that represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime, but it was the skeletal remains in the back of the cave that explained the smell and Morrison's choice of hiding place. Someone, probably a prospector or trapper, had died here long before the outlaw arrived, and Morrison had simply added his treasure to what was already a tomb. "We can't carry all of this," Buck observed, estimating the weight of gold and silver scattered throughout the cavern. "We don't need all of it," Joe replied. "Just enough to prove we found it, and enough to make Mr. Morse listen to reason." Buck filled 2 canvas bags with gold coins and small bars, leaving the bulk of the treasure untouched. Whatever happened in the next few hours, this cave would either become a crime scene investigated by federal marshals or a graveyard for everyone who tried to claim its contents. As they prepared to leave, Jo paused beside the skeletal remains and pulled something from her pack, a small wooden cross Martha had carved for the church. She placed it gently beside the bones and whispered a prayer for the unknown person who died alone in this place. The gesture reminded Buck why this child was worth protecting, why some things mattered more than gold or legal justice or even survival itself. Jo represented hope for a future where kindness could triumph over greed, where the innocent could be shielded from the consequences of adult failures. Emerging from the cave, Buck found the night transformed. Distant gunfire echoed from the direction of the ranch, and the horizon glowed with the orange light of burning buildings. The standoff had erupted into open warfare while they'd been underground, and Buck realized their carefully planned timeline had collapsed. "They started without us," Jo observed. Her voice steady despite the implications. Buck checked his weapons and calculated distances. 3 miles back to the ranch, across terrain now controlled by hostile forces, carrying evidence that would either save his friends or get them all killed. "Can you run?" he asked Jo. "As fast and as far as you need me to." Buck looked at this remarkable child, brave beyond her years, determined to save people who'd shown her kindness, willing to sacrifice a fortune for the chance to protect her chosen family. In that moment, he understood that Jo had already become everything he'd hoped Sarah might have grown up to be. "Then let's go home." The ranch bell that Samuel used to call his hands for meals now clanged with desperate urgency, its bronze voice carrying across the darkness like a battle cry. Buck and Jo approached through the timber that bordered the north pasture, the canvas bags of gold weighing heavy in Buck's hands as gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the ranch buildings. From their concealed position behind a fallen cottonwood, Buck could see the tactical situation had deteriorated rapidly. The main house was under siege, muzzle flashes sparking from its windows as the defenders returned fire. The barn had become a secondary fortress, with ranch hands, Pete and Carlos, visible in the loft, their rifles picking targets among Morse's attackers. But it was the sight of Martha Thornton calmly reloading a shotgun on the front porch that made Buck's chest tighten with admiration and fear. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, seemingly oblivious to the bullets chipping splinters from the porch posts around her. "There's too many of them," Jo whispered. Counting the muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills, Buck's tactical assessment reached the same grim conclusion. Morse had committed at least 40 men to the assault, professional fighters who understood cover and crossfire. The defenders were outnumbered 8-1, their position deteriorating with each passing minute. "We need to change the equation," Buck said, his mind working through possibilities. "Draw some of their attention away from the house." "How?" Buck hefted the bags of gold, feeling their substantial weight. "By giving them what they came for." The plan that formed was desperate and dangerous, but it offered the only chance Buck could see to save the people who'd become his family. He would approach Morse under a flag of truce, using the gold as leverage to negotiate a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Jo would circle around to the barn and help coordinate the defense if negotiations failed. "I don't like leaving you alone," Jo said, her green eyes reflecting the distant flames. "I won't be alone long. Either this works and the shooting stops, or it doesn't and you'll need to help the others." Buck handed her his spare pistol, the scaled-down Colt they'd practiced with. "Remember what I taught you about breathing and aim?" Jo accepted the weapon with steady hands. "Mr. Buck, what if Mr. Morse doesn't want to negotiate? What if he just wants to kill everyone who knows about his crimes?" Buck had been wondering the same thing. Men like Morse didn't build empires by showing mercy to their enemies, and too many federal crimes had been committed for simple bribery. To solve the problem, then we make him pay so dearly for his gold that he wishes he'd never heard the name Morrison. They separated in the darkness. Jo, moving toward the barn with the silent grace she'd developed during their training sessions. Buck watched until she disappeared into shadow, then began his approach toward the cluster of lights that marked Morse's command position. The railroad baron had established his headquarters in the relative comfort of a large military tent, complete with camp chairs and a folding table covered with maps. Buck counted at least a dozen guards between his position and the tent, all of them alert and well-armed. "Morse!" Buck called from the edge of the firelight, the bags of gold clearly visible in his hands. "We need to talk." The shooting slowed as word spread through the attacking force. Within minutes, an uneasy quiet settled over the battlefield, broken only by the distant sound of wounded men and the crackle of burning wood. Clayton Morse emerged from his tent with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. Even in the middle of a gun battle, his clothes remained immaculate, his silver hair perfectly groomed. "Mr. Wilde," Morse said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. "I assume you've brought me something interesting." Buck hefted the canvas bags. "Blackjack Morrison's treasure. Gold coins, silver bars, enough to cover what was stolen from your bank and then some. How gratifying. And in exchange for this generous offer, you call off your men and ride out. Leave the Thorntons alone, forget about Joe, and consider your debt settled." Morse's laugh held genuine amusement. "My dear fellow, I'm afraid the situation has evolved beyond such simple arrangements. You see, there are federal marshals involved now, witnesses to my methods, evidence of activities that certain government officials might find troubling." Buck felt cold realization settling in his chest. "You never intended to make a deal." "Oh, but I did. Originally, I would have been quite content to recover my gold and eliminate the Morrison bloodline quietly. But you've forced me to commit resources and reveal capabilities that require, shall we say, comprehensive resolution." The sound of approaching riders came from multiple directions as Morse's reserves moved into position. Buck realized with sinking certainty that he'd walked into a trap designed to eliminate the last obstacles to Morse's complete victory. "The child dies tonight," Morse continued conversationally, "as do the federal marshals, the ranch family, and anyone else who might testify about recent events. Tragic outcome of a violent confrontation with dangerous outlaws, I'm afraid." Buck's hand moved toward his gun, but the rifles trained on him from a dozen positions made the futility of resistance clear. He'd gambled everything on Morse's greed overcoming his caution, and he'd lost. The battle for Joe's life and the souls of everyone who'd tried to protect her was about to begin in earnest. The first shot came not from Morse's men, but from the barn loft, where Joe had taken position with the precision Buck had taught her. Her bullet took down the guard closest to Buck, creating the chaos he needed to dive for cover behind a wagon loaded with railroad supplies. Gunfire erupted from every direction as the temporary ceasefire shattered into desperate combat. Buck rolled under the wagon and came up shooting, his Colt finding targets with the deadly accuracy that had made him a legend among territorial lawmen. "Kill them all," Morse shouted over the gunfire, his composed facade cracking as his carefully planned operation descended into the kind of brutal fighting he'd hoped to avoid. No witnesses, no survivors. From her position in the barn, Joe proved that weeks of training with Buck had transformed her from a helpless child into a formidable opponent. Her shots were measured and precise, each bullet finding its mark among Morse's. Attackers who had underestimated the threat posed by an 8-year-old girl with perfect aim and steady nerves, Marshal Hayes and his deputies had turned the ranch house into a fortress, their federal badges meaning nothing now except as targets for men who'd already committed themselves to murder. But they fought with the disciplined efficiency of professional lawmen, making every shot count and using their limited ammunition to maximum effect. Samuel Thornton moved through the chaos with the grim determination of a man defending his life's work. His rifle spoke with methodical precision, and Buck realized the rancher had military experience he'd never mentioned. Martha matched her husband shot for shot, her shotgun devastating at close range as Morse's men tried to storm the front porch. But numbers were telling. For every attacker who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. Buck counted muzzle flashes and realized Morse had committed over 50 men to the assault, mercenaries, railroad guards, and hired killers who fought with professional competence. The turning point came when Buck spotted Ezra Cole leading a flanking movement toward the barn where Joe had positioned herself. The bounty hunter had recruited a half-dozen gunmen, and their coordinated advance threatened to overwhelm her position. Buck made a decision that went against every tactical instinct he possessed. Abandoning his cover, he sprinted across open ground toward the barn, drawing fire from multiple positions. Bullets whined around him, one grazing his shoulder and another burning across his ribs, but he reached the barn alive. "Joe!" he called, vaulting through the rear door as Cole's men approached the front. "We need to move." Joe appeared at the top of the ladder, her small face smudged with powder smoke, but her eyes bright with fierce determination. "I'm not running anymore, Mr. Buck. This is our home, and I'm going to defend it." Buck felt pride and terror in equal measure. This brave child had found her strength and chosen her ground, but courage alone wouldn't stop the killers closing in around them. "Then we make our stand here," Buck said, checking his ammunition. 4 rounds left in his Colt, plus the spare cylinder in his belt. Against 6 professional gunmen, it would have to be enough. Cole appeared in the barn doorway like a harbinger of death, his scarred face split by a cold smile. "End of the line, Wild. Hand over the girl, and I might let you live long enough to watch what happens next." Buck's response was 2 quick shots that sent Cole diving for cover. The barn erupted in gunfire as the bounty hunter's men spread out to surround their position. Bullets splintered through wooden walls, sending splinters flying like deadly rain. From her position in the loft, Joe's rifle cracked repeatedly, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. Buck watched in amazement as she methodically eliminated threats with the cool precision of a veteran fighter half a century older. But the odds were impossible. Cole had positioned his men to cover every exit, and their superior numbers allowed them to maintain constant pressure while conserving ammunition. Buck realized they were fighting a delaying action at best, buying time for a rescue that might never come. That was when they heard it, the sound that changed everything. Distant but unmistakable, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching at full gallop. Not the measured advance of more attackers, but the desperate charge of riders pushing their mounts to the limit. Through gaps in the barn walls, Buck caught glimpses of new arrivals streaming into the ranch yard. Federal marshals, territorial militia, and even some of the townspeople from Bitter Creek who'd decided that standing up to corporate bullies was worth the risk. Marshal Hayes had succeeded in getting word to the territorial capital, and the cavalry, literal and figurative, had arrived just in time. The tide of battle shifted dramatically as Morse's mercenaries found themselves caught between the ranch defenders and a relief force that outnumbered them 3-1. Professional fighters began laying down their weapons rather than face certain death in a lost cause, but Clayton Morse wasn't finished. Buck spotted the railroad baron making his way toward the barn with a small group of his most loyal gunmen, his face twisted with the fury of a man watching his carefully laid plans collapse around him. The final confrontation was about to begin. 6 months after the battle that changed everything, the sign outside the ranch gate bore new words carved in weathered oak: the Morrison Wild Ranch. Below the name, in smaller letters, Samuel had added, "Home to all who need one." Buck stood on the front porch in the early morning light, watching Joe practice her letters with Martha at the kitchen table visible through the window. The child's penmanship had improved remarkably, though she still preferred the lessons he taught her about reading. Tracks and understanding weather to the formal education Martha insisted was equally important. The final confrontation with Clayton Morse had ended not with gunfire, but with the cold click of handcuffs as federal marshals took the railroad baron into custody. Faced with overwhelming evidence of his crimes and the testimony of dozens of witnesses, Morse had finally understood that his money and influence couldn't buy him out of every situation. The treasure they'd recovered from Blackjack Morrison's cave had indeed covered the stolen bank funds, with enough left over to compensate the Thornton family for their losses and fund improvements to the town of Bitter Creek. Buck had insisted that Joe make the final decision about the distribution, watching with pride as she chose to use her grandfather's ill-gotten gains to build a school and fund an orphanage that would ensure no child suffered as she had. "Penny for your thoughts," Martha said, emerging from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. Buck accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that had become one of the small comforts of settled life. "Just thinking about how much has changed since that first day at the hiring line." "You mean the day you paid double wages for a scrawny 8-year-old who nobody else wanted?" Martha's smile held warmth and gentle teasing. "I still think you might have been touched in the head." "Maybe I was, but it was the best decision I ever made." Through the window, they could see Joe helping Samuel repair a section of fence, her small hands surprisingly capable with tools, and her attention focused on learning the details that separated good work from sloppy craftsmanship. She'd grown in the past months, gaining height and confidence in equal measure, but the fierce independence that had first caught Buck's attention remained unchanged. "She asks about her grandfather sometimes," Martha observed. "Wants to understand how a good family can produce someone who causes so much pain." Buck had wrestled with those same questions, trying to help Joe understand the complex legacy of blood and choice that shaped every life. "What do you tell her?" "That people are more than their worst actions, and children are more than their parents' mistakes. That she gets to decide who she becomes, regardless of who came before her." It was good advice, Buck reflected, and not just for children. His own journey from guilt-ridden ex-lawman to protective father had taught him that redemption was possible for anyone willing to choose love over fear, hope over bitterness. The sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the road, where a familiar figure on a distinctive horse was making his way toward the ranch. Marshal Hayes visited regularly, partly for official business related to the ongoing federal case against Morse's conspiracy, but mostly because he'd developed a grandfatherly fondness for Joe that reminded Buck of his own transformation. "Uncle Bill," Joe called, abandoning her fence work to run toward the approaching marshal. Hayes had become family in the way that mattered most, through choice and affection rather than blood. Hayes dismounted with a grunt that spoke of too many years in the saddle, but his smile was genuine as he swept Joe into a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "How's my favorite deputy?" he asked, setting her down and examining the badge he'd carved from wood and presented to her on her 9th birthday. "Learning important things," Joe replied solemnly. "Mr. Buck says understanding people is harder than understanding horses, but more important, Mr. Buck is a wise man. What else has he been teaching you?" Joe's eyes sparkled with mischief. "That shooting straight is important, but knowing when not to shoot is more important." Hayes laughed and ruffled her hair. "Sounds like martial thinking to me. You ever consider following in your old man's footsteps?" The casual reference to Buck as Joe's father brought a warmth to Buck's chest that he still wasn't entirely used to. The formal adoption papers had been signed months ago, making their relationship legal as well as emotional, but hearing it acknowledged by others never failed to move him. "Maybe," Joe said thoughtfully. "But first I want to make sure bad people like Mr. Morse can't hurt other children the way they tried to hurt me." Buck joined them in the yard, extending his hand to Hayes in greeting. "Any news from the territorial capital?" "Morse was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison," Hayes reported. "His railroad empire is being broken up and sold to pay restitution to his victims. The legal precedent should make it harder for other corporate bullies to use private armies against honest citizens." "And Ezra Cole?" "Dead," Hayes said simply. "Tried to escape custody during transport and made the mistake of drawing on the wrong marshal. Some problems solved themselves." That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Buck found himself studying the faces of the people who'd become his world. Samuel and Martha, whose ranch had become a symbol of resistance to corporate greed. Joe, whose courage had inspired adults to remember what they were fighting for. Hayes, whose commitment to justice had saved them all. They were an unlikely family, brought together by tragedy and held together by choice. but they were real in a way that transcended blood or law or social convention. After dinner, Buck and Joe walked to the small cemetery on the hill where a new marker stood beside the older graves. The inscription read simply, "Blackjack Morrison, father and grandfather, may his legacy find peace through love." Joe placed wildflowers at the base of the stone, a ritual she'd begun shortly after the battle ended. "Do you think he'd be proud of what I did with his treasure?" Buck considered the question carefully. "I think he'd be amazed by the woman you're becoming, and I think he'd understand that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to choose a different future." Joe nodded solemnly, then slipped her small hand into his larger one. "Thank you for choosing me, Papa Buck." As they walked back toward the house, where warm light spilled from windows and the sounds of family life promised safety and belonging, Buck felt the weight of his old badge shift in his pocket. He still carried it, not as a burden of guilt, but as a reminder that justice could wear many faces. Sometimes a lawman's star, sometimes a grandfather's love, sometimes a child's courage to choose hope over hatred. The past would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their future. They had built something new from the ashes of tragedy, something worth protecting and preserving for generations yet to come. In the distance, the ranch bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice carrying across the peaceful valley like a promise that some things, family, love, and the courage to defend what matters, would endure long after the last echoes of gunfire had faded into memory.